At Christmas time in the Black Forest, there was a woman many years ago, there was a woman by the name of Annika. And Annika's husband had been killed in a hunting accident, and so she was left in this small cottage in the Black Forest to raise her 2 small children. So she moved her mother in to help her, of course, right? So Annika every day would go out into the forest to forage for mushrooms and berries and fruit, and once in a while a rabbit, so that she could feed her children. Well, this particular winter was a very harsh one. It was very cold, and the snow 4 feet deep. So she couldn't get firewood to keep her family warm, and there were no mushrooms or berries to be found anywhere, and certainly no rabbits. So she was out looking and looking. She and her mother hadn't eaten for 2 days, and her children hadn't eaten since the day before. So she was pretty desperate, looking and looking for something that she could feed her children and something that she could burn in the fireplace to keep them warm. When she found a couple of small pine cones, well, she picked the pine cones up and she put them in the basket on her back. And she thought, well, they won't provide too much warmth, but at least it'll take the chill off. And perhaps I'll find something that I can feed the family. And if not, maybe I'll find more pine cones and I'll be able to sell them. So she looked and she found a few more pine cones, and she bent down, and as she picked them up, she heard a little voice. "Why are you taking my pine cones?" And she looked around and she didn't see anyone. "Excuse me, why are you stealing my pine cones?" So she looked, and up on a tree branch was a tiny little elf. And she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know they were your pine cones. I'm looking to get something to feed the fire to keep my family warm, and perhaps, if I'm lucky, cook something for my children today so that we all have something to eat." And the little elf said, "Well, you can keep those that you took, but if you go over that hill over there into the deeper part of the forest, you'll find some much better pine cones, and you might even find something that you can feed your children." Well, he was so certain that she decided to follow his direction. So she trudged up over that hill in the 4 feet of snow, and sure enough, there were giant pine cones. They were very dense, and she thought, wow, he was right. These pine cones will forge a huge fire. They'll keep us warm for a long time, and maybe I'll even be able to sell some and get some flour or some meat, something to feed my children. So she was very excited about these pine cones. So she gathered them all up and put them in the basket. And when the basket was full, she looked up, and there went a little bunny. She pulled out her slingshot, and she saw that she only had 2 stones left, so her aim had to be sure. She pulled that slingshot back, and boom, off went the stone, and it hit the rabbit. Down the rabbit went. So now not only did she have something to make a big, luscious fire, but she also had a rabbit to feed her children and her mother. She was ecstatic. So she put the basket back on her back, and she started to head down the hill back home. And as she was walking, the basket seemed heavier and heavier, and she thought, well, maybe I'm just tired. And the more she walked, the heavier the basket felt. And she thought, what is going on? I can't be that tired. And by the time she got back to her house, she could barely walk. Well, off went the basket, and as she dumped it out, she saw that all of those big pine cones from the second part of the forest had turned to solid silver. The ones underneath from the first part were still just regular old pine cones, but the other ones were silver, and she was overjoyed. She thought, wow, now I'll be able to take a couple of these into town and sell them, and I'll be able to buy food and firewood and feed my children for the whole winter. And so that night they had a roaring fire, and they had the rabbits for dinner, and the next day she took 2 of those pine cones into town to sell, and she bought some flour and some meat and some cheese to feed her family for the next couple days. And 2 days later, she took 2 more pine cones down into town, and 2 days later, 2 more pine cones into town, and that basket never emptied. There were always silver pine cones. What magic that elf gave her. What a gift he gave her, a gift of prosperity and good fortune. For the rest of her days, she had plenty of silver pine cones to sell, plenty of money to be able to buy food and firewood for her children. And from that day to this, if you go to the Black Forest in Germany and you go visit someone at Christmas time, you'll be expected to bring a silver pine cone as a symbol of good luck and good fortune.